Have you ever heard of units that may have gone unnoticed, yet changed the course of history? Soldiers whose names were never written on banners or engraved on monuments. Small groups that moved in the shadows, operating between scribbled maps, whispered orders, and dust-covered roads, yet carried on their shoulders the weight of entire battles, perhaps even entire wars. While you've probably heard of famous divisions, celebrated generals, and operations that made it into school textbooks, there is another side, forgotten, erased, buried beneath the weight of the grand narratives. Small units, invisible platoons, improvised detachments, volunteer battalions, and even clandestine groups that altered the course of World War II and other conflicts without ever receiving the spotlight. Picture yourself at the front. 4 or 5 men inside an abandoned cabin, a radio hissing, maps with red circles marking roads and bridges known to no one but them, a commander writing coordinates by candlelight, and a soldier scanning the horizon through the lens of a borrowed pair of binoculars. Imagine the silence, not an ordinary silence, but the silence that precedes a shot, an ambush, a sabotage, something that would decide not only the fate of those men, but of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of other combatants who would never know who their true saviors were. These units didn't appear in newspapers, were rarely photographed, almost never filmed. Yet they were responsible for things such as breaking enemy lines, destroying ammunition depots, capturing secret documents, interrogating deserters, planting false messages, securing roads, holding flanks, slowing offensives, and even coordinating airstrikes with surgical precision, all while the rest of the army believed victory would come only through sheer numbers and the industrial power of the nations involved. This is the story of small battalions that shaped entire wars, starting with the American Rangers in North Africa and Normandy, moving through Soviet reconnaissance units planted behind German lines, Polish sabotage groups operating in Warsaw, British commandos who emerged from the sea like shadows and vanished before anyone could react, and even Norwegian volunteer units who climbed frozen mountains to prevent the Nazis from obtaining radioactive material needed to develop nuclear weapons. To the eyes of great strategists, they often seemed irrelevant. Small numbers, few resources, zero prestige. But once the smoke cleared and the reports landed on the generals' desks, even they had to admit that without these forgotten soldiers, history might have followed a very different, perhaps far darker, path. Let us begin with the U.S. Army Rangers, a unit that was born small, experimental, considered by many an imprudent idea, inspired by the British commandos and tested for the first time in North Africa in 1942. While entire divisions advanced slowly through scorching sands, facing minefields and fortified positions, small groups of Rangers ran under the moonlight, climbed cliffs, sabotaged fortifications, neutralized German sentries, and opened breaches so that the larger armies could advance. In terms of numbers, they were not impressive, around 500 men in their initial formation. In terms of impact, they were a silent earthquake. And that impact only grew once the war reached Normandy. On D-Day, when thousands of ships, planes, and men converged on the French beaches, it was a reduced group of Rangers who received one of the most insane missions of the operation, scaling the cliffs of Point du Hoc under enemy fire to destroy artillery batteries that could turn Omaha Beach into a slaughterhouse. The order was clear: Rangers lead the way. And they led, while bullets ricocheted off the rocks and explosions opened craters in the ground. Those men hanging on ropes managed to seize German positions, destroy strategic targets, and ensure that the troops landing on the beaches wouldn't be obliterated before they even reached the top. Was it a suicide mission? Probably. Was it decisive? Without a doubt. Yet while the history books celebrate D-Day as a massive Allied triumph, few remember that the difference between victory and disaster may have been made by little more than 100 men climbing a cliff. But the Rangers were not alone. If we shift the map eastward, passing through devastated Poland and heading into the Soviet Union, we find Soviet reconnaissance units known as the Razvedchiki, small detachments that operated behind German lines collecting intelligence, intercepting transmissions, and sabotaging communications. Different from a classic image of the Red Army as a gigantic machine crushing everything with numbers and armor, these groups represented the opposite. Few men trained for camouflage, infiltration, and deep survival in hostile territory. They hid in frozen forests, observed German convoys through scopes, noted quantities of tanks, marching directions, and logistical patterns, and then transmitted everything to Soviet command centers, allowing major offensives to be assembled with precision. Some cities such as Stalingrad, Kursk, or Minsk could only be defended or retaken because small reconnaissance units discovered exactly where, when, and how the enemy would attack. There are accounts of veterans describing missions that lasted weeks, with minimal food, no fires, sleeping inside holes covered with branches so that German reconnaissance aircraft, yes, the Germans used observation planes similar to modern drone concepts, wouldn't detect them. They were the invisible intelligence of the Soviet machine, and without them, the generals would be nothing more than blind strategists facing chaos. Now we return to the heart of occupied Poland, where the Armia Krajowa, the Polish National Army, operated, often remembered vaguely as partisans, yet their structure was far more complex and sophisticated. Among them existed small, specialized units responsible for ambushing German military trains, blowing up bridges, executing Nazi officers, and gathering information about everything from anti-air battery positions to ammunition factories. One of the most impressive feats accomplished by these micro-units was the attack on the SS headquarters in Warsaw, carried out by just a handful of fighters who entered disguised, opened fire, eliminated key targets, and escaped before the city even understood what had happened. Another operation was the assassination of General Franz Kuchera, the Nazi police chief in Warsaw, executed by a small group in broad daylight in 1944 in a mission timed like a Swiss clock. Actions like these undermined German control and inspired the population to resist, something that would echo all the way to the Warsaw Uprising and influence post-war Europe. Yet who knows the names of those fighters? Who knows their faces? Who knows their voices? They are forgotten soldiers. And that is just the beginning. While grand narratives were unfolding on the European front, other small units emerged in completely different scenarios, and few were as intriguing as the British Commandos, known as the Special Operations Executive (SOE). Created with a very simple yet extremely audacious objective: set Europe ablaze. This secret organization trained men and women for sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla operations in Nazi-occupied territories. Unlike the formal divisions of the British Army, the SOE was not part of the traditional military structure. Its members were sent to countries such as France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Norway not to fight open battles, but to infiltrate, observe, sabotage, and coordinate local resistance movements. Each agent operated practically alone or in teams of 2 or 3, equipped only with a pistol, a radio, knowledge of local maps, and clandestine contacts who could disappear from one day to the next. Among the numerous missions carried out, perhaps the most decisive was the sabotage of German heavy water production in Norway. To a modern audience, this may sound technical and distant, but to the scientists and strategists of the time, it potentially meant changing the outcome of the atomic race. In a scenario where the United States and Germany were racing to develop nuclear weapons, the heavy water produced at the Vemork plant was considered essential for the German reactor. If the Nazis could produce enough of the material, they might advance their atomic project before the Allies. So a small group of Norwegian agents trained by the SOE was parachuted into mountainous territory during the Arctic winter, facing temperatures that could freeze lungs and terrain where a single misstep could trigger an avalanche or a fatal fall into a ravine. They hid in isolated cabins, ate moss, hunted reindeer, and waited weeks until they could infiltrate the plant. When they finally entered, they planted explosive charges with precision and vanished into the darkness as the explosion shattered months of German scientific work. And all of this was done by fewer than 10 men. 10. This story, often told only in specialized books or little-known documentaries, shows how small units changed not only battles, but potentially the technological course of the war and the world. But the SOE was not the only organization operating in the shadows. On the other side of the planet, in a tropical environment unfamiliar to most European combatants, there were units operating in the Pacific Theater, where the Second World War took on a completely different form, dominated by dense jungles, tropical diseases, absurd distances, and an enemy that rarely surrendered. Among the little-remembered units in this scenario were Merrill's Marauders, officially known as the U.S. Army's 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional. Formed in 1943 and sent to Burma, modern-day Myanmar, their mission was to push hundreds of kilometers through jungle, sever Japanese lines, infiltrate hostile territory, capture strategic airfields, and support the British effort to prevent India from falling to the Japanese advance. They were not thousands. They possessed no tanks or armored vehicles, just a little more than 2,900 men carrying everything on their backs, while facing malaria, dysentery, fevers, insect bites, and constant ambushes. They sometimes marched for weeks without seeing towns or roads, only mud, leeches, rain, and the enemy's trail. In several accounts, veterans claim that the jungle killed more than the Japanese, and yet, when the dust settled, these men had captured the airfield at Myitkyina, one of the most strategically important points of the campaign, critical for allowing Allied supplies to cross the Himalayas into China. When they completed their mission, fewer than 200 were still fit to fight. They do not appear in Hollywood films beside famous generals, nor in iconic photographs of the war's end. They appear only in reports, belatedly awarded medals, and memories recorded by trembling voices decades later. And yet, without them, the entire Allied strategy in Southeast Asia would have collapsed. Returning to the European continent, but now to the south, we find another group that rarely receives credit: the Italian commandos who fought as part of the resistance after Mussolini's fall. When Italy capitulated in 1943 and the Germans occupied the north of the country, many Italians gathered into autonomous units, some with only a few dozen men, to sabotage rail lines, blow up bridges, and prevent the flow of German troops toward the fronts at Anzio and Monte Cassino. In many cases, they were young people, without formal training, workers, farmers, teachers, and even priests, who received clandestine explosives from the Allies and mapped weaknesses in the German infrastructure. In cities such as Turin, Milan, and Bologna, these groups operated with near-surgical precision to delay the advance of German divisions reinforcing the Gothic Line. There are accounts of ambushes on mountain roads, midnight meetings in abandoned barns, and sabotage operations involving everyone from engineers to 15-year-old boys delivering messages. None of this reaches the main pages of military history, but the cumulative impact of these small actions was measured in days of delay, and every day of delay for the Axis meant less time to consolidate defenses, fewer supplies reaching the front, and more openings for the Allies to advance. And while all these groups were operating in Europe, we cannot forget one of the most emblematic examples of the power of small units: the Chindits, an irregular British force created by Brigadier Orde Wingate, also operating in Burma. Unlike Merrill's Marauders, the Chindits had a mission more oriented toward guerrilla warfare and strategic confusion: to penetrate deep into Japanese territory, destroy railways, cut communications, and confuse enemy command. They operated in small columns, relying on Allied parachute drops for supplies, and constantly moving to avoid encirclement. One veteran described the campaign as walking sick and starving into the mouth of a tiger, hoping it wouldn't notice you until you'd done enough damage. The impact of their actions is recorded in Japanese reports citing logistical disorganization, emergency redeployment of divisions to regions previously considered safe, and growing paranoia about what the British were planning. All of this was caused by fewer than 9,000 men spread across dozens of micro-columns inside thousands of square kilometers of jungle. And this still does not bring us to the end. We are merely sketching the map of forgotten units that shaped 20th century military history. But if we're talking about jungles, guerrilla warfare, and small units that influence conflicts, we cannot ignore one of the most fascinating cases of the Second World War: the Filipino guerrillas who fought against Japan after the fall of the Philippines in 1942. When the Japanese seized the country and the remnants of the U.S. and Filipino armies surrendered at Bataan and Corregidor, the war seemed finished in that theater. However, instead of accepting their fate, hundreds of small units formed across the islands, often with a handful of surviving soldiers, stray officers, and armed civilians, creating a guerrilla network that not only resisted, but supplied vital intelligence to the United States for years. On islands such as Luzon, Panay, Mindanao, and Samar, Detachments of fewer than 50 men ambushed Japanese patrols, destroyed rice depots, intercepted messengers, and transmitted information through improvised radios. These fighters, who often had to hide entire families in the mountains and battle tropical diseases, ensured that when General MacArthur finally returned to the Philippines in 1944, he did so knowing exactly where Japanese airfields, supply routes, positioned units, and even guard rotation schedules were located. They did not just fight, they prepared the battlefield for a less deadly, amphibious landing. There are records of small groups who hid radios in buried ammunition crates, emerging only at dawn to transmit coordinates of Japanese ships moving between islands. This information was used directly for air and submarine attacks, impacting Japanese naval control in the region. And yet, in the most popular history books, the names that appear are only MacArthur, Yamashita, and Nimitz, never the Filipino captains, sergeants, and civilians who spent entire years living like ghosts in the mountains. While the Pacific was boiling, Europe continued to be a brutal laboratory for specialized small units. Among them, one of the most peculiar was born inside the German army. The Brandenburgers, a reconnaissance and special operations unit created even before the war began, whose purpose was to infiltrate enemy territory using disguises, forged documents, and fluency in multiple languages. Contrary to the common myth that portrays Germany as mechanized and rigid, the Brandenburgers operated with almost cinematic flexibility. In 1939, during the invasion of Poland, small teams disguised themselves as railway workers and seized bridges, tunnels, and stations before the panzer divisions even reached those locations. In 1940, during the invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands, they drove in fake postal trucks, cut telephone lines, and captured key positions before regular troops even realized they were at war. In 1941, during Barbarossa, they assumed Soviet identities, setting up ambushes and intercepting communications. They never numbered more than a few thousand men, and many operations involved teams of 4 to 12 soldiers, but the strategic effect was enormous. They destabilized defenses, created panic, and accelerated offensives. Curiously, despite being an extremely efficient unit, they were erased from post-war narratives for being part of the German military apparatus. And, as a result, even military researchers often skip over their role in the early invasions because their existence is inconvenient to the linear narrative of Blitzkrieg by tanks alone. However, while some of these groups were technological and structured, others were almost artisanal, born of extreme necessity. An example of this were the Canadian Combat Engineer Units in the early years of the war, particularly during the Dieppe operations and later in Italy. Dieppe in 1942 is often remembered as a disaster for the Allies, but few realize that while most forces were being massacred on the beaches, small units of Canadian engineers managed to achieve specific objectives under heavy fire, such as destroying obstacles, opening passages, and obtaining intelligence on German coastal defenses. That may sound like a detail, but it was precisely that intelligence that fed critical decisions and modifications used 2 years later on D-Day, such as types of submerged obstacles, calibers of fixed machine guns, and patterns of interlocking fire. And in 1943 to 45, when the Allies fought in Italy, those same engineers were responsible for crossing mined rivers, building bridges under artillery bombardment, and clearing roads through the mud and snow of the Apennines. Many battles only advanced because 15 or 20 men managed to assemble a Bailey Bridge in 40 minutes in the middle of the night, while mortar rounds exploded around them. It's a completely different image from the glorified war. It's the dirty, heavy, silent war that depends on small groups doing extremely technical things, while most others sleep or retreat. And if we cross Europe toward the Balkans, we will find even more examples. Between 1941 and 1945, Yugoslavia was the stage for one of the most complex guerrilla wars in modern history, fought between communist partisans, monarchist Chetniks, and German, Italian, and Bulgarian forces. Many analyses cite Tito as the great figure of movement, but they forget that Yugoslav resistance depended essentially on small mobile detachments, often composed of a dozen fighters, who blew up railway tracks night after night. The German occupation campaign in the region failed repeatedly because the Germans could not protect the rail lines that crossed thousands of kilometers of mountains. And who were these saboteurs? Students, factory workers, shepherds, former officers of the Royal Army. Men and women carrying dynamite wrapped in cloth and setting fuses with pocket watches. They were not armies. They were small units that destroyed more trains in a single year than mechanized divisions could in open battles. In 1943, German reports stated that the enemy is not seen, cannot be tracked, and reappears everywhere, describing exactly the impact of this type of unit. And despite all that, how many YouTube videos or popular documentaries explain how 15 guerrillas with 10 kilograms of explosives can delay an entire offensive? Almost none. And there is still much more. We are far from finished. And while the Balkans burned, we cannot ignore the fact that the Second World War also extended northward, into regions where the cold was as lethal as any weapon. On the Arctic front, among mountains, fjords, and boreal forests, small units operated that challenged both the German army and the environment itself. One of the most significant examples is that of a Norwegian ski troops, small detachments trained for combat in snowy terrain, who knew how to move silently on skis, while conventional troops sank into snow up to their knees. These soldiers not only provided direct resistance to the Germans after the occupation of Norway in 1940, but also supported British and SLE operations in sabotage and reconnaissance missions. In many cases, we're talking about teams of fewer than 10 men infiltrating frozen valleys, observing convoy movements, destroying telephone lines, and disappearing before the Luftwaffe could identify them. There are reports of entire missions in which not a single shot was fired, yet they cut communication wires that delayed German orders for hours. And hours in war are equivalent to lost cities, failed battles, disrupted supply lines. But what made these groups particularly fascinating was the fusion of local knowledge with military purpose. They were fishermen, hunters, guides, and mountaineers who suddenly found themselves holding rifles, radios, and explosives, fighting to prevent their nation from being completely absorbed by the Reich. And although they rarely appear in documentaries, the truth is that without them, Nazi occupation would have been far more efficient and resistance, far less connected to London. And while we're talking about extreme landscapes, it's impossible to ignore what happened in North Africa, where small units shaped campaigns that are usually attributed only to famous generals like Rommel and Montgomery. One of the most underestimated groups in this theater was the Long Range Desert Group LRDG, a British unit specialized in long-range reconnaissance, initially composed of New Zealanders. For those unfamiliar, the Libyan and Egyptian desert wasn't merely empty. It was a vast expanse of sand where one could drive for days without encountering anything but dunes, rocks, and shimmering horizons. In this environment, traditional divisions were slow and vulnerable, but the LRDG used light trucks, navigated the desert with special compasses and astronomical maps, covering hundreds of kilometers to observe movements of the Afrika Korps, destroy improvised airstrips, capture sentries, and gather intelligence that would be transmitted to the Allied command in Cairo. There are reports showing that battles, such as El Alamein, were planned based on information obtained by small LRDG groups, sometimes consisting of just 8 men and 2 trucks. While generals maneuvered thousands of soldiers, these small groups moved invisibly, shaping the invisible map of the war, the map of information. And a fascinating curiosity is that many of these missions involved navigating at night guided by stars, just as sailors had done for centuries, with the caveat that any mistake could bring them dangerously close to Italian or German patrols and end in capture or instant death in the middle of an endless sea of sand where no one would hear their screams. And yet, when we talk about North Africa, almost no one mentions these men. We only mention Rommel, his tanks, and the famous cat and mouse game with Montgomery. Still within the desert, but expanding into the concept of clandestine warfare, we find something even more obscure. The OSS teams, the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA. The OSS acted as the American equivalent of the British SOE, training small groups to operate behind enemy lines in France, Italy, the Balkans, and even China. In many cases, these were 6 to 10 man teams, with a radio operator, an explosive specialist, a liaison officer, and a few local fighters. Their mission was to train guerrillas, coordinate airdrop supply deliveries, collect intelligence, and direct Allied attacks. They operated mainly at night, hid radios inside trenches and ditches, and frequently moved from village to avoid German tracking. There is an emblematic case in France in which an OSS team spent entire weeks inside barns and caves transmitting information about German armored movements, allowing the U.S. 9th Air Force to bomb whole columns before they reached critical fronts. They weren't just eyes, they were insurgency amplifiers. And because they were a young, experimental, and secretive organization, almost none of these agents became famous after the war. Many even died without being able to tell what they had done, because their work was legally protected by secrecy. But perhaps one of the most unusual examples of how small units shaped conflicts appeared long before World War II, during World War I, when armies were still learning what it meant to fight on an industrial scale. In a conflict dominated by endless trenches, machine guns, and artillery, special units emerged known as infantry raiders. Small groups trained to attack enemy trenches, capture prisoners, and destroy positions before the enemy could react. They moved in the silence of dawn, armed with knives, grenades, and pistols with rudimentary silencers. Many modern commando and special forces tactics were born from these raids, which involved precise mapping, temporal coordination, and a psychological coldness that is almost incomprehensible. And while World War I is remembered for battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele, there's no denying that the evolution of infiltration operations profoundly influenced future military doctrines. In fact, some of the German storm units, the famous Sturmtruppen, emerged from this context, learning to advance in small groups instead of forming dense lines under enemy fire. These same tactics would be reused in 1940 during the Blitzkrieg. Historiography chooses to focus on enormous armies. And the most impressive part is that we still have dozens of examples, from French saboteurs blowing up railway lines before D-Day, to Japanese reconnaissance units roaming the jungles of New Guinea, to detachments of Chinese volunteer soldiers cutting Japanese supply routes in the mountainous interior of Yunnan. And the most important thing is, we still haven't reached the end. And to understand how far these small units influenced not just battles, but the political course of entire nations, we need to look beyond the traditional fronts and observe the role of groups that operated in the underworld of strategic intelligence. A masterful example of this comes from occupied France, where resistance cells waged an invisible war that ranged from printing clandestine pamphlets to capturing Gestapo officers, intercepting secret documents, and guiding downed Allied pilots to the Spanish border. It's easy to speak of the French resistance as a single organism, but in reality it was composed of hundreds of tiny groups. Some had fewer than 5 people, met in dark basements, and operated typewriters under the risk of immediate execution. Others were made up of railway workers, who, during the day, adjusted locomotives, and at night removed bolts from tracks or tampered with braking systems to derail German ammunition trains. In 1944, when the Allies were already liberating Paris, German reports indicated that more than 1,500 railway sabotages per month were being carried out by small groups, delaying mobilizations and forcing the Nazi command to divert entire units to internal patrol duties. In other words, armored divisions that could have been fighting in Normandy were stuck hunting electricians, mechanics, and philosophy students. This absurd asymmetry, where groups of 3 or 4 civilians could frustrate field marshals, is one of the greatest proofs of the power of small units when applied with intelligence and purpose. And there is still one last component that almost never receives attention: the post-war. Because after the guns fell silent and the surrender papers were signed, these small groups vanished into the darkness as silently as they had appeared. Many returned to their villages, their jobs, their families, without medals, without ceremonies, without writing memoirs. Some carried trauma for decades. Others died without anyone knowing they had derailed locomotives, guided offensives, blown up bridges, or transmitted enemy coordinates over the radio under threat of torture. When documentary researchers interviewed Filipino veterans in the 1990s, many cried not because of the pain of war, but because no one had ever asked what they had done. When Norwegian historians recovered SOE archives, They discovered that agents who had prevented German nuclear advances spent the rest of their lives as carpenters, fishermen, or primary school teachers, and died without ever considering themselves heroes. When Soviet archives were opened after the collapse of the USSR, it was revealed that some strategic offensives had only been possible because razvedchiki units infiltrated weeks earlier had identified routes and armored concentrations, and yet their names were buried in gray folders marked confidential. And the most astonishing part is that almost all these accounts share a common thread: the awareness that they were too small to be remembered by the big books, yet big enough to alter the course of the world. If we put all this into perspective, we realize that military history, and human history itself, is not made only by great numbers, great armies, great generals, and great diplomatic treaties. It is also made by groups of 10 men walking in the dark, by women transmitting messages on clandestine radios, by engineers assembling bridges under bombardment, by hunters gliding on skis through frozen valleys, by students placing explosives on railway tracks, by sailors navigating through the desert guided by the stars. These forgotten soldiers were the small pins that toppled huge dominoes. They were the shadows that created cracks in the concrete of war. They were the sparks that ignited fuses that exploded far beyond their immediate reach. Without them, World War II would have been different, and perhaps the world as well. And now, after all this, we are left with the question that opens this documentary. Have you ever heard of these small units that could have passed unnoticed, yet changed history? If the answer was no, now you know. And you know something more. You know that while flags waved, speeches echoed, and tanks advanced, it was these invisible groups who ensured that the machinery of victory did not jam. War is not made only by famous heroes. It is made by people no one saw, no one filmed, no one honored. But who were there? And as long as there are people telling their stories, they will not be forgotten. If you enjoyed this content and want to learn more hidden stories that changed the course of wars, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes. And comment below, which forgotten unit do you find most impressive? Your participation helps keep alive the memory of those soldiers that history almost erased.